Today we're going a slightly different direction than normal, but I'm going to convince you why I think Google search is one of the biggest untapped opportunities for e-commerce brands. And we're going to do it by exploring how important is Google search for your brand. Search often is considered to be volume constrained. And the reason for that is because it is demand capture. Okay, where Facebook or other often referred to as top of funnel tactics can be thought of as demand creation, search exists as demand capture. Another way to think of that is that it's post query, meaning something has to prompt the user intent from a search basis in order for you to deliver your ad, whether it's a search ad or a shopping ad. It exists after some impetus. Whereas in social, you might show up in someone's feed that's not even thinking about your brand and create demand altogether in theory. Google is often thought of as demand capture purely, and therefore has maybe less scale available to it than other channels. But I think that might be hiding some of the potential to consider this channel. So to start, I want us to think about the opportunity for search on this XY chart for your brand, okay? And on the X-axis of this chart, we have competition. How many people are bidding for a query? And on the Y-axis, we have volume. And depending on where your brand falls in these four quadrants will determine how immediately obvious the opportunity is for you in search, and therefore what percentage of your budget should likely end up in this channel. So I'm going to name each of these four quadrants to illustrate the kinds of businesses that might sit in each of them. So starting with the most obvious opportunity is when there is a high volume of searches and a low level of competition. We'll call this the arbitrage sector. Oops, AGE, arbitrage. High volume, low competition. A really obvious example of things that would fall into this sector would be something like masks in March of 2021, 3/21, where in that moment, the competition for face masks matched the demand prior to COVID. Then suddenly there's a massive increase in the volume. So the volume skyrockets, right? And for a period, there's a gap between the volume and the competition. So this area underneath the connection between these 2 points, okay, represents pure arbitrage. Okay, this is the opportunity where the volume suddenly outpaces the demand. Now, what happens in the arbitrage category, because we are in a perfect capitalistic market, is that this competition ramps up very quickly. And suddenly you have a much smaller gap because very quickly the demand gets satiated. But for a moment in time, there is pure arbitrage where the volume exceeds the competition such that the price you pay for every click here is profitable. That's the ideal state. Now, much more commonly for a lot of our categories is what I would call the commodity section. Think of this as things like shoes or jeans or makeup or anything where there is a ton of volume, but there's also a ton of competition, okay? In these areas, so I'll say shoes, pants, I said makeup, right? Any category where there is a ton of searches, a lot of categorical volume, but also a lot of competition. And this just means that simply a lot of the profits in these sectors have been competed down to zero because somebody's willing to pay more for the next click. Okay. Then down here, we have in the low volume, low competition, what I'll call the startup sector. These tend to be new ideas that have not yet really produced a lot of volume. There's also not a lot of competition, so they tend to be very profitable clicks. I'll use an example in this case. When we were selling Kalo silicone wedding rings, when we started out, okay, the amount of searches for silicone rings was very low. Now, we could occupy all of those clicks at a very cheap cost because there was literally nobody bidding on the term silicone ring. And so there was, every click was super cheap and we could capture, but there just wasn't much volume. And so we were really constrained because we were in a low volume, low competition arena. Now, these tend to be very profitable clicks, but low volumes of them. And then over here in this sector, which is probably the least common sector, we have what I'll say are really high value terms. Think of this as like all, we'll call this the luxury clicks section, if you will, which is that they're scarce, but really, really valuable. And in my world, a really obvious one is something like Facebook ad agency, okay? The total search volume relative to a commodity like shoes or pants or makeup is incredibly low, but the competition is actually really high because they are really, really valuable high intent clicks, okay? So you could right now take your brand and you could place it into one of these four categories. And what I would say is that the closer you are to arbitrage, the more of your ad budget likely sits in Google or search in general. So what I tend to see is it looks something like this, where if this is where you sit, upwards of 75% of your budget should live in search if you're in the arbitrage sector. If you're in the commodity sector, it tends to be closer to 50-50, where there's just so much opportunity. And I say 50-50 between social and search. So where that exists as there's lots of volume, but there tends to be efficiency constraints that actually constrain the volume. It tends to not be about whether or not you could go get more budget. It tends to be the degradation of the efficiency of that budget. Down here, you'll see something closer to 10% of your budget because there's just no volume. And then over here, it's hard to say because the media services tend to be a little bit more disjointed, but you can actually get closer again to this, let's call it, you'll see anywhere between 25 to 50% can exist in this area. So in terms of how important the search is for your brand, this is like the immediately obvious scale. If you live here, search is probably everything. It's going to be very difficult for there to be a more profitable dollar anywhere else, right? But if you're over here, they're going to lead to different bid strategies. So really, the function of competition also defines your bid strategy. That's also going to determine your volume. Now, we know that in most cases, there is an inverse relationship. So we're just going to make a note here. There's an inverse that informs how we think about how much opportunity it is. The inverse relationship between volume and efficiency, okay? And this is especially true in search. He who's willing to pay the most for the clicks will get the most clicks, right? So generally speaking, the bid strategies in these areas tend to vary like this. They tend to run a spectrum that goes from what I would call IS or impression share bidding, okay, to over here you have what is referred to in Google as TROAS or target ROAS, right? So in this case, when you're in this sector, you're trying to soak up as much of the volume. You want all of the volume because it's all efficient. So you're going to tend to bid for max impression share. I want to show up for every single query. On the competitive lens, if you bid for impression share, you're going to end up spending a ton of money because you are going to end up costing yourself a lot of money to win those search volumes. So over here, you tend to bid more for target ROAS. And so the question just becomes, whoever has the best margin, whoever has the best LTV, can pay the most for the click, can get the most out of this channel. So other ways that search becomes really important besides these factors is if you have high margin, okay, and high LTV, you can bid for a higher click cost, okay? And what that means is that you can capture and win in commodity marketplaces because you're willing to pay more. There's also a strategic opportunity here that says, hey, if I'm in a healthy cash position, or I know if I'm an incumbent competing against an up-and-coming brand, especially in this moment where the cost of capital is high, there's an opportunity to suffocate this channel, to alleviate the volume entirely by bidding all of it up to take out any competitor's ability to capture volume. And I've seen brands where for a while they'll say, okay, for the next 3 weeks, we want 100% impression share on, blush, or 100% impression share on black denim. That is going to be a ton of money, but for a while you are going to suffocate a competitor's one of their core value capture areas. So there can tend to be strategies here. But what I want to talk about today is the idea that any brand, if you put yourself in this sector or this sector or this sector, any brand that is not yet in this sector, your job, your opportunity is to find ways to move into this section. Okay? This is what you are always looking for. And in Google, we tend to think about the opportunities that we have for search as being limited. Most of us think about the arena of terms that relate to our brand is very narrow. We'll upload our product feed and we'll allow all the keywords and title names to dictate the search volume. And we sort of think of that as the total universes of queries that make sense for us. And so we sort of think of this as an immovable object. We are stuck in the quadrant that we exist in. Silicone rings, there's no volume, therefore search doesn't matter to me. Well, I want you to think about how we could possibly consider the idea that there is opportunities to move into this and treat Google less like demand capture and more like Facebook, like demand creation, okay? Because a user giving you a search query for something that you would say put in a Facebook ad as a value proposition is actually a very powerful opportunity for demand creation. And so how can we think about the best way to leverage that opportunity? Sorry about that lighting change right there. I'm going to give you an example using silicone wedding rings of things that may push up into this space, or at least expand the amount of area that you can cover in this section. So while the search volume for silicone rings is really low, there's a whole set of terms that if we were to think about the value proposition, let's imagine if we're designing funnels on Facebook. Things that we talked about, okay, were things like ring avulsion, okay? Now, ring avulsion is a term for when you get your ring stripped off because you're wearing a metal ring and it gets stuck on, let's say, a manufacturing assembly line, or you're a police officer hopping a fence. These are real things that occur. Well, ring avulsion is an opportunity that in a Facebook ad, we may think about designing an ad that shows the opportunity, that speaks to police officers and people who work on assembly lines, and we design a funnel to a landing page, but we don't often treat search like that. And ring avulsion wasn't obviously in our product description or title, and so it wouldn't show up in our shopping feed. But if we could look at that and go, okay, what would a landing page for people who are searching ring avulsion, what would it be like to give them an opportunity to show them in search the ability to drive queries for this into Kalo silicone wedding rings as a solution for a problem? Now we can begin to stack queries that may not be immediately connected to ring avulsion. Another one is like metal allergies. Okay? Again, not something that's going to necessarily show up in the product description. Alternative wedding rings. Or how about lost wedding ring? Okay? These all represent value propositions. We used to run these funnels a lot to like people who are going on their honeymoon and just got a really nice wedding ring. How about, this is a good one, honeymoon planning. Okay, this might not be an immediately obvious search query, but I guarantee you, now this might be a problem because there could be a ton of travel bidding that may push this into this category and not actually move me the right way. But I can tell you something like ring avulsion is certainly low competition from a product standpoint. There's not a lot of bidding there. So my job is to think about all the ways that people relate to, how about manufacturing line safety gear? Like all of these ways that your product could potentially connect to this. And what you have to do to make this work is you can't just run your normal search text ad to your PDP. You have to build a landing page in the same way that you would design a funnel for Facebook. And if you do that, I believe that if you take the time and effort, there's a huge opportunity to turn Google into this for your business and to not be stuck in this quadrant. And so my challenge for all of us is to say, okay, depending where we exist. If we're here, then don't worry about these games. Bid, impression share, grab the volume as fast as you can, because eventually all this demand is going to be satiated. If you exist in this category, we've got to start to find some ways to win, because there's a point at which somebody else, especially if you're a smaller business, is going to be willing to pay more for the click than you. And in that scenario, how can you win? Well, we all have to find ways by expanding the categorical terms, the broader impact. I want you to go look up an SEO case study on Masterclass. Okay? Masterclass. And this is, again, we think about this from an SEO standpoint, and we're like, oh, okay, well, what search terms could we win on an SEO? And we think about blogs, right? We'll write blogs that define the opportunity. And what Masterclass did is they thought about a cooking school. Let's say they were having Gordon Ramsay teach a cooking class. Well, what they realized was that the opportunity was to show their ad with high intent, to think about this almost like a Facebook audience, to show their ad to anybody who's looking for anything related to cooking. And so they have this legendary SEO case study where they built out thousands of blogs for general cooking tips. If you were thinking about like the translation between a tablespoon and grams, okay, that's a cooking related query that has nothing to do with searching for a cooking class. But what if Masterclass became the answer to that question? What if they built a landing page for common kitchen conversion metrics? Or let's say somebody was looking for how to grill or temp to grill a hot dog. Okay? Again, not an obvious thing that means somebody has intent, but what it means is they like cooking and they're looking at Google for answers. So if Masterclass could write a blog that has to do with the 10 best or the temperatures to cook every meat, and they could win on an SEO basis, they could begin to make that people aware of the fact that they provide great answers and great teaching material to their content. The same thing can be done on a paid basis. How can you think of every query not just as pre-existing demand, but that it is a user intent signal that allows you to create new demand for your business? And if you do that, search goes from being volume constrained to having the largest volume anywhere in the ad world. Because the amount of searches and YouTube volume is endless. There's an infinite amount of inventory if you can get creative and put some of the energy we put into Facebook advertising and creative planning and landing page design into thinking about the categorical terms and the broader set of queries that allow us to turn Google from demand capture to demand creation, and to move out of a commodity sector or the startup sector or the luxury click sector into this area of arbitrage. And so there's endless opportunity. It doesn't matter if you're a services business or if you're selling a product. Search is a massive untapped opportunity, and we're going to see them continue to find ways to push advertisers, and advertisers that go out of their way to solve beyond the obvious set of terms are going to find massive opportunity in this sector.